So, hello everyone. We're live here in a super exciting talk with Gerald Carter, about his work with vampire bats and kinship behavior, and kinship and cooperative relationships between them. Gerry studies cooperation in social networks in bats, but he's also interested in other animal systems as well. He's an assistant professor at the University of Ohio State University, and a research associate at the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute. He did his bachelor degree at Cornell, a master's at the University of Western Ontario, and a PhD at the University of Maryland. He was also a Humboldt fellow at Max Planck Department of Collective Behavior. And I have a big pleasure, and also I'm very excited as well to hear about his talk about vampire bats. So with you, Gerry Carter.
Okay, thanks so much. So I'll go ahead and start.
It's okay. Yeah.
Okay. Sure there. Yeah. Okay, so I'll start with talking about the role of kinship in social evolution. So the evolution of altruistic traits and cooperative traits has always been the central topic in evolutionary biology. Say again? Is it okay? Should I keep going?
Sorry, there was an echo here from my YouTube. I just fixed it. You can continue. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no worries. Okay, so the question is, why should an organism that evolved by natural selection help others at a cost to itself? And this puzzle was essentially solved by inclusive fitness theory, often called kin selection. So the main reason why organisms do this, why they reduce their own survival or reproduction to help others, is because they're helping kin. And in the 1970s and 1980s, there was this almost revolution, sort of a minor revolution in sociobiology, or what we now call behavioral ecology, because you could identify the genetic structure in a society, an animal society, or a group of organisms using molecular tools like microsatellites. So I started out with the allozymes, and now we have all of these genomic tools. But so back in the 1970s, 1980s, where you wouldn't have to try to reconstruct the pedigree of a group of animals. You could just go in and use genetic markers and figure out who's related to who. And this really confirmed that cooperative groups tend to be families. And so there's classic examples. Eusocial insects are a family. Cooperative breeders tend to be highly related to each other. Cooperation that you see in other organisms, like outside of vertebrates, like slime mold, for instance. This is all consistent with kin selection. Okay, so however, obviously not all cooperation is altruistic. Not all of it is kin biased. There's a lot of cooperation that occurs between different species. For instance, mutualisms, like pollination or seed dispersal. And there's also these exchange mutualisms, like you see with plants exchanging carbon for phosphorus with mycorrhizal fungi. And these mutualisms are also ubiquitous and all over the place. And so these are not examples of altruism, and they're mutually beneficial. And so one common but simplistic view has been that there's two categories of cooperation. There's helping between nonkin, which we can't explain by kin selection, and then there's helping between kin, which we can explain with kin selection. And there's a tendency to sort of say, when you see relatives cooperating, you can explain all of this with kin selection. And the problem with this view is that kinship alone is not enough to suppress selfishness and eliminate conflict among kin. And there's increasing evidence for this. But one of the classic examples is just look at eusocial insects. So eusocial insects are sort of paragon of reproductive altruism. We know relatedness plays a key role here because eusociality originated in lineages with lifetime monogamy. And this kinship structure shapes the scale of competition. So you have low conflict within these colonies that are families compared to a lot of competition between colonies. But within each colony, there's still the possibility for sort of selfish cheating. So workers can try to have their own offspring rather than just raising the offspring of the queen, which is the reproductive altruism that we're thinking about when we think of eusocial insects. And the selfishness is reduced by enforcement, also called worker policing. So here, can you see my cursor? Hopefully you can see my cursor. So on the left, we have, these are clonal ants. So their kinship is one, and they are stretching out this individual. They're essentially punishing this individual that tried to, this is a worker that tried to have her own offspring in the colony. So she is cheating. Here's another example of worker policing in bees, sort of holding these insects, holding this worker down, stretching them out. They punish them, they kill the offspring. And over here on the left, we can see the propensity for this selfishness within a colony and relatedness on the x-axis. And here you can see that relatedness is actually positively correlated with this cheating. So relatedness itself is not leading to the suppression of reproduction here. These individuals are, or it's not, it may have originated through kin selection, but it's not maintained purely through kinship, eliminating all conflict. The conflict is eliminated through this enforcement behavior, through policing. So colonies that are highly related have a lot of cheating, but as you have more effective policing, there's a reduction in this cheating. So if we turn to mammals, we see that kinship and cooperation have this, are sort of related to each other in this way in terms of different kinds of genetic structure can lead to different kinds of social complexity. So people have often disagreed about what exactly social complexity is. And Lucas and Klettenbrock in 2018 wrote this paper to sort of say, well, there's really two different kinds of things you could be talking about here. There's organizational complexity, where you have a cooperative society. So these are cooperative breeding mammals. They have high relatedness within the group. They're family groups. There's often a dominant female that monopolizes reproduction. And so you have female reproductive skew, you have breeders and helpers. And so you have altruistic traits that benefit the group. But then there's another kind of social complexity, is what you see in primates that have complex relationships. Everybody's breeding. The kinship in these groups can be much lower. So for instance, yellow baboons have kinship, which is an order of magnitude lower than naked mole rats, which are highly inbred and live in family groups. So yellow baboons, they live in a group with maybe some family, but mostly nonkin. And each baboon has a family, close friends, might have allies, rivals, bullies. So they have these individualized relationships. And all of the females are capable of breeding. And so there's kind of dominance hierarchy and cooperative relationships that are all individualized. So I really like this paper, except for one thing, which is that they leave out bats. So a lot of people who are interested in social evolution of mammals tend to, for some reason I don't know, tend to just skip over bats and think that there's not a lot known about cooperation or social complexity in bats. So bats make up a fourth of mammals, and there's huge functional diversity even within a single family. So this is the famous New World leaf-nosed bats, where you have bats that are eating insects or fruit or nectar or meat or blood, like the vampire bats, or fish. So a huge diversity in ecological lifestyle, and also large diversity in social behavior. And so I just want to highlight a few examples of this, because they really show that bats in some ways might deviate from what we see in other mammals. So one reason why people choose to ignore social complexity in bats, I think, is that there is no cooperative breeding in bats. There are no bats that live in family groups and have breeders and helpers. However, there are these case studies of cooperation that is very, very strong forms of cooperation that are really fascinating. So the bats with the highest mean kinship that I know of are these disc-winged bats that live in little groups of one or maybe two families, and they have these suction cups on their thumbs so that they can stick to the smooth inside of a leaf. They live inside of a furrowed leaf, and they fly around and move around as a group, and they make these little calls to attract each other. So one bat goes in the leaf and calls the other ones over. And this is one of the few bat societies where there's high relatedness. Most bat societies have very low relatedness. So here's an example: greater spear-nosed bats. These are females that are all completely unrelated to each other. They come together, they form a group of nonkin, and then they converge on a special call that acts as a kind of group signal within their call. There's some evidence that they forage together and monopolize food together as a group, but there's also some behaviors that they do, like defense of young. So if a female has a baby, it's very likely, for whatever reason, that these babies sometimes fall out of the roost and fall to the ground. And when that happens, females from other groups will come over and kill that pup. but unrelated females from the same roost from the same group will fly down and protect this pup. And it's not completely clear why this happens, but can't be explained by kin selection because these are unrelated females. And there's a lot of group level behaviors here. So there's reproductive synchrony, there's vocal learning at the level of the group, there's things like babysitting and this pup defense, and hard to explain based on just kinship. And vampire bats are interesting because I think in many ways they're convergent with what we see in primates in terms of they have nepotistic relationships, these complex, stable, long-term relationships that are part of a larger fluid society. So each bat has its own sort of network of individuals that it grooms and forms new relationships with, and many of these individuals are related, but not all of them. So I'm going to focus here on vampire bats. This is what I've been working on pretty much my whole career. So one of the advantages of studying cooperation in vampire bats is that they groom each other like primates, but they also do this quantifiable helping behavior where they share food. One bat regurgitates food into the mouth of another bat. It's just like you see a mother bird doing for its chick. Other animals do this for their offspring, but vampire bats do it for other adults, including non-kin. The other advantage here is that they're very small compared to primates, and so we can study them in a lab environment and recreate a lot of the drama that we know plays out in the wild. So we know that in the wild, they're in these spaces that are like the size of a small closet. We can create this in the lab, and we see all of the same behaviors playing themselves out. And I'll explain later how this is very useful. So to back up and talk about the food sharing, so vampire bats feed on nothing but blood when they're adults, and they have to feed pretty much every night. If they miss 2 meals, they're very weak. If they miss 3 meals, meaning 3 nights without food, then they can starve to death. But they have the social safety net because they can come back to the roost, and other bats will regurgitate food to feed them if they're in dire need. And like I said, this is often kin, but not always. And these donations are important in nature, as I said, because bats are often missing meals. So the young bats are missing a meal every 2 weeks, or the adults are missing a meal every 2 weeks. The younger bats are missing a meal about every 3 days. So it's often the case that they're in need. And we can induce these donations in the lab by fasting a bat overnight and putting it back in and see who feeds it. And so we can also do all kinds of experiments where we try to manipulate the situations under which they would share food. So for instance, here we've trapped a bat inside of a small cage and forced a donor to come down to the ground and feed it through the cage bars. So this is how we know it's really pro-social behavior and not just the result of like harassment, like I'm going to feed you just to make you go away. And I've been studying this for over, I guess, 10 years now, different captive groups. And the basic idea is I do a fasting trial, I pull a bat out, put it back in, and then see who feeds this. And I've done this in a number of different locations. So the question is, why do the bats share food? And there's several hypotheses. I'm going to clump into these 3 categories, but basically I think there's evidence for some of all of this. So indirect fitness benefits, in other words, kin selection, is almost certainly playing a role here. Reciprocity, as I'll show you, I think is also playing a role, meaning that I think the bats reward individuals that help them. So they feed individuals that help, they feed individuals that feed them. And I also think that there's a role for what's called fitness interdependence. So this just means that even before we consider the conditional act of helping, if in fact it's conditional, there's a kind of inherent correlation between the fitness of these individuals. But this is very difficult to test. So I'll sort of take you through a series of experiments that support these ideas. But the main thing I want to get across here is that it would be very easy to explain this with kin selection because so much of the food sharing behavior happens among kin. And so it's a controversial case because a lot of people think, can we just explain this through kin selection? And I want to show you that that's really not the case. So I do think this has origins in kin selection. So food sharing, I think, is co-opted for maternal care. Vampire bats make really extreme maternal investments. They have, like all bats, but they're even exceptional for bats. So they have one big pup. They have this extended gestation period, which is like 7 months. It's a really long time for a bat. Nursing continues for 10 months, more than 3 times longer than other neotropical bats. They carry this infant around. It's half their mass. And they balance this slow reproduction with a long lifespan. So they can live 17 years in the wild. I have records of about 30 years in captivity. So as far as I know, all females feed their pups with blood through regurgitation, and this continues when the pups grow up. The males disperse after their first year. The females are philopatric, and their mothers keep feeding their daughters. So the daughters eventually start reciprocating, and I've seen daughters as young as 4 months old regurgitate food back to their mother when their mother's hungry. This is a very unique thing if you can think about an animal that's actually hasn't been weaned yet but is able to feed her own mother. I can't think of other cases in other mammals where this probably happens. Okay, so all of these relationships tend to be symmetrical. There's two-way sharing. So you have a mother sharing with her daughter, the daughter grows up, but also she's sharing food with other kin, so like sisters. But then there's this non-kin sharing, and then often you see these weak non-kin ties. And it's meaning that this bat's feeding this bat, but we haven't seen it in the other direction. And it's possible that this is actually reciprocal, but we just haven't seen the return. We haven't seen the reciprocal sharing because this is rare, and so we have less data about these relationships. But the reason to be skeptical about any explanation beyond kin selection is that about 95% of food sharing in the wild is between close kin. So most of it's with offspring, and the rest of it is with other close kin. And so it's reasonable to ask, isn't this all just kin selection? Is there something else going on beyond kin selection? And vampire bats have been sort of famous as this textbook example of reciprocal altruism, but is this really warranted? Can we explain this with just the idea that most of the food sharing is going to kin, and so there's this kind of spillover that happens to non-kin, say perhaps because it's worse to let, if you're going to make a mistake, you might be more willing to accidentally feed non-kin than to allow your kin to die. And so that kind of error could easily lead to these reciprocal sharing, these sharing events between non-kin. And what I want to argue is that that's not the case, especially over the last few years, the experiments we've done, I think, have eliminated this possibility. So the original evidence for reciprocity comes from the observation that the food sharing relationships are biased towards kin, but also they're only occurring between bats that are switching roosts together. So bats that are staying together about 60% of the time, those are the bats that are sharing food, and we don't see bats that don't have strong associations sharing food, but we do sometimes see a bat that is unrelated receive food. So during my PhD, I tried to disentangle these things by getting a group of bats with mixed kinship. So the kinship in this group is exactly what you'd expect in a wild population, except all the bats are in captivity for a long period of time, and we know who knows who, and they're all familiar with each other, and they're all highly associated. They're all stuck together. So we've controlled association, and now the question is, well, what's important, kinship or the reciprocal sharing rate towards you? And so this is showing a food sharing network of bats where each bat is a node. The females are the red nodes. They're really the individuals that form these food sharing relationships with other females. Males don't form relationships so much with other males. And female and male relationships are weaker, tend to be weaker. So it's mainly a female behavior. And the width of these arrows from one bat to another is the food sharing rate from A to B. The best predictor of the sharing rate from A to B is B back to A. It's the reciprocal rate. So that's these like football shapes that you see here. And kinship here can be estimated in different ways. So what I've been doing is just using microsatellite markers, which is a very old technique, not super fancy, but this is one way of getting kinship. But what's even better than that is if you have the pedigree. So we do know the maternal pedigree, which we can use to check estimates from tissue samples. And then the most powerful thing is when we look at bats that we just know are unrelated because we get them from completely different populations. And this is, I think, the most convincing case where we can really eliminate kinship as an explanation, as we'll go into. So one thing I want to discuss is that when we talk about reciprocity and evidence for it, we tend to focus on reciprocity only among non-kin. And this is because when we see cooperation between kin, we just assume it's caused by kinship. But it could also be caused by reciprocity. And the problem there is that we cannot disentangle those things. So can we detect reciprocity among kin? And by reciprocity, again, I just want to clarify that what I mean is that the reason that A helps B is because B helps A. So it's, I'm making an investment in you because you're making an investment in me. And so that leads to the symmetry, but kinship, this leads to the symmetry and helping. But kinship would also lead to a symmetry and helping, because if I'm related to you, then you're related to me, which means that we both help each other in both directions. So one way to try to tease these apart is to do an analysis where you just do a kind of like multiple regression. And so the standard one with social networks is called multiple regression quadratic assignment procedure. It's just a randomization test. And there's a problem here because the precision of these two things that we want to look at are actually quite different. So what has happened with the use of molecular tools is that we can get pretty precise estimates of kinship. And if you have a pedigree, it's even more precise. And this precision is based on the number of markers that you use. But regardless of how many markers you have, you're sampling every individual evenly. And people know when they're estimating kinship, or at least they should know, that you should try to get some kind of confidence interval around that estimate. And so people can do this through something called jackknifing or bootstrapping, but you do some sort of simulation to get a sense of how accurate are these measures. Now, when you're studying reciprocity, you're actually interested in this sort of symmetry, which is trying to get at the underlying relationship. And this is based on the number of observations that you have. And it tends to be the case that you don't actually have enough observations. It's almost always the case that if you're taking visual observations, you're just never going to get the number of observations. You need to get really precise estimates of every single individual, because you can only see one individual at a time, and you're not sampling everybody evenly every time. So, and there tends to be biased sampling across individuals, and people haven't really taken to heart the idea that you should be measuring the precision or the confidence of the relationships that you're seeing. So if bat A is helping bat B like 2 out of 10 times, right? So you have 20%, that's the rate, for instance. How precise is that number? And usually it's not very precise, and people don't bother trying to estimate it. So one way to show this is to look at how the story changes, the relative importance of, say, kinship and symmetry. How does this change as we increase the number of observations that you have? So here I'm showing the number of trials that you sample from your data, and on the y-axis is a coefficient from a model. And what you can see is that kinship quickly reaches this asymptote, and then it's stable. So the story is not changing as you collect more data. But you can see here with symmetry is that symmetry is continuing to increase. And so if we had stopped the study back here at 100 observations, which is roughly what the very first study on food sharing in vampire bats only had 21 observations. So it can be difficult to get observations of this food sharing. And if you have very few, you would come to the conclusion that kinship is very important and symmetry it's not very symmetrical. But as you can see, even when we get to 400 observations, we still haven't actually seen this start to stabilize. So we can make these kinds of plots with other animals. So for instance, here's mandrills and some macaques. And here you can see that when we get all the way out here to 1,500 observations, we can see that symmetry is more important for predicting grooming. The reciprocal grooming rate is more important for predicting how much A is going to groom B compared to the kinship. But it takes a really long time before we see that. And we can see that this rate here is still going up slightly. Here again, this is a case where kinship is clearly important. And these macaques, kinship is more important than symmetry. But we can't even say that there's symmetry that's different than 0 until here. So if we had only 200 observations, we would say, oh, there isn't even evidence for symmetry, but there's obviously evidence for nepotism. And so the basic point is that it's much easier to detect evidence of nepotism than it is to detect evidence for reciprocity if you don't have very many observations of the helping event that you're trying to study. So we could also do simulations where we just actually set these things to different levels and see how easy it would be to detect. So here's an example where the true relationships, because this is simulated data, the true relationships are completely reciprocal. They're completely symmetrical, and they're only partially nepotistic. But here you see that when these things are correlated with each other, you will detect a kinship bias. This is the kinship bias, and this is the symmetry. So here I just told you that symmetry is complete. It's 100% true, whereas nepotism is only partially there. It's only partially explaining things, but you get the complete reverse opposite picture. Now, the same thing could be true if you had really poor estimates of kinship. So you could imagine a scenario where kinship is not very well estimated, but you have an excellent measure of association. So for instance, if you have little tracking devices on animals where it samples every animal like every 2 seconds, which we have examples of and I'll show you, that would be a situation where it would be much easier to detect the strength of the social relationship rather than the kin relationship. So this is just something you need to take into account, but it makes it impossible to sort of tease apart these explanations just from observational data, which is why we need experiments. So I'll go through some experiments that are showing that kin selection is not the sole explanation for this. And the strongest evidence comes from the fact that nonkin form new reciprocal food sharing bonds in ways that cannot be explained as a byproduct of kin selection. So I'll show you an experiment on this. So the question here is, how do female bats develop new food sharing relationships when they meet an unrelated stranger? How does this get going? Is it just a mistake, or do these relationships build up in a way that shows that kinship isn't important, but rather your previous social experience is what matters? So there's this idea called raising the stakes or testing the waters, which is the idea that the way to build up a reciprocal relationship is you start by making a small investment, and then you increase this gradually over time in your best partners. And this is something that works in computer simulations with other strategies, and humans also do this when they're playing sort of economic public good games. But what would it look like in animals like vampire bats? And does this exist in nature? And there haven't been good examples of it because we almost never see how cooperative relationships that are long-term, we almost never see how they form from the very beginning, like since the animals met. For instance, in primates, we very rarely would see that. So one way this could work is that, for instance, 2 individuals that just met, maybe they try clustering, it's very low cost, then maybe they groom, they transition to higher cost or riskier cooperative behaviors. They might build tolerance up this way. They might try grooming, and if that's reciprocated, then they might groom more, and then eventually they share food. So this is what we tested in the vampire bats. I haven't talked about social grooming, so this is a bat grooming itself. A bat that's grooming itself is several times more likely to be groomed by another bat in the group. So they're actually sensitive to cues of need, it seems, because they respond to what a bat's doing. They also try to remove like the bands that we put on their wings, or if you mess up their fur, that bat will be groomed more by others. Vampire bats groom each other more than any other bat, to my knowledge. So here are grooming rates of vampire bats compared to other bats. Female vampire bats spend 5% of their active time grooming each other, regardless of whether they have ectoparasites or whether they're in the lab or in the field. Okay, so this is what we expected to see. Increase in grooming, that is going to become reciprocal. A grooms B, and then this goes back and forth. And then once this reciprocal grooming has been established, then we expect to see food sharing at that point. So to test this, we grab bats from completely different parts of Panama, so we know they're unrelated and also unfamiliar. They're hundreds of kilometers apart. And we put them together in captivity. We did this in small groups. We did this in large groups. And the basic idea was to see, will they eventually form relationships? And so we kept them in captivity for almost 2 years. And during that time, we saw this accumulation of new relationships forming. So this is over a period where everybody's put together. This is a period of 10 months. 15% of the females that were previously unfamiliar formed food sharing bonds with each other. And then most of them were grooming by the end of this experiment, of being stuck together in prison, essentially, for upwards of almost 2 years. Everybody's, not everybody, but many bats are grooming each other. And then there's also several bats that were born into the colony, and we also looked at how they started building relationships with others. So one thing we expected to see is that there would be increases in the grooming rate from A to B over time, and that these increases would occur when B later fed A, but not for cases where B never fed A. Okay, so time is on the x-axis, the y-axis is the probability of A grooming B, and then we should see this divergence in the 2 different kinds of pairs, so pairs that do feed or don't feed. And this is exactly what we saw. So the grooming dynamics before food sharing ever happened, predicted the formation of a new food sharing relationship. This increase only happens before the relationship is cemented. So if you create a day 0 for each food sharing relationship, you should see grooming ramping up before that, but not afterwards. And this, again, what we saw. And so these relationships emerge also in a reciprocal pattern, which is one of the other key predictions. So A fed B, that made it more likely that B would feed A for the first time. So the bats do appear to build up these new reciprocal food sharing relationships by testing the waters via grooming. This makes no sense if the non-kin relationships are just an extension of something that evolved for kin selection. It can't be explained by bats just feeding bats that smell like them or seem like them phenotypically, because and the other thing I didn't mention is that they actually bond faster when they're isolated with fewer bats. So a question that might come up is, why do bats form non-kin bonds when they already have these kin bonds? Why not just reciprocate with kin? Why have these weak ties at all? Are these just mistakes or not? And one thing that's interesting to note is that there's actually quite a lot of variation between bats in how many non-kin partners they feed. So some bats are feeding a lot of non-kin, and other bats are feeding almost no non-kin. And so here's an example. These are different bats, the number of non-kin they feed in blue, and then this is each bat's sort of maternal network, which it's born into. So it doesn't have any control over the red bars, but it does have control over the blue bars. And so one possibility here is that they're actually trying to manage the quantity of the relationships that they have. So there's several possibilities here. So it could be that there's actually divergent strategies for quantity or versus quality. So some bats have more non-kin bonds, more relationships. Other bats have fewer, stronger bonds. And it might just be that one of these strategies is better, or it might be that there's some kind of trade-off. So it could just be due to errors. So like I said, maybe it's better to feed non-kin than to let your kin die. And actually the best strategy is to invest in the highest quality relationships, but just as a kind of error, you're just accidentally feeding outside of this because you're not sure who your kin are. So this is kind of kin recognition errors. Another possibility is that it's the complete opposite, that actually these bats are doing it correctly. You want to have as big a network as possible, and these ones are just not able to have a big network for whatever reason, so they're stuck with their kin. And then a third possibility, which I call social bet hedging, is the idea that both of these strategies are advantageous under different circumstances. So specifically, the wider network might be more advantageous when it's a riskier situation. And so the bats are investing in non-kin to diversify their investments beyond kin, to buffer against a change in the social environment. So suddenly, if a mother-daughter is lost, then suddenly it becomes useful to have these non-kin relationships. But before then, it might not be useful. So to test this idea, we removed either a primary donor from each bat or a non-donor, and then we looked at how the subject coped with this situation. How well were they fed, and did it depend on how many non-kin they had fed before? So I'll show the results here. On the y-axis, we have the average food received during that trial. That's how much food the bat was able to get in a fasting trial. On the x-axis, we have the number of non-kin females that bat had fed in the past 4 years, controlling for opportunity to feed. And first, I'll show the response when we remove a non-donor. This is like the control condition. And then I'll show you what happens when we remove the key donor. And the different hypotheses make different predictions. So the fact, if the bats are just making errors, then what we expect to see is that you always get most food. You do the best when you're just feeding your relatives, and as you get away from that, you're just doing worse in both conditions. If more is always better, then you should always be doing better when you feed more non-kin, and these bats are just doing worse over here. And then social bet hedging suggests that when the non-donor is removed, there's really no advantage to these non-kin bonds, or maybe there's even a negative relationship. Maybe you're even worse off. But the point is that this relationship should only show up when you remove a key donor. Okay, so this is the actual data. When we remove the non-donor, you can see there's not an increase in food received when you have more nonkin partners. So the bats that are doing the best are the ones that are feeding fewer nonkin, not more nonkin. Under normal circumstances, females that help more nonkin did not receive more food. But when we remove the key donor, suddenly this relationship changes. Females that help more nonkin now did receive more food. Why did they receive more food? It's because when we remove their key donor, that's like a mother or a daughter, the bats that only have that individual as a food sharing partner suffer a loss, whereas these ones are then fed by the nonkin that they had been feeding in the past. So it shows that there's a kind of cryptic benefit to having these nonkin, and this is supportive of this idea of that both quantity and quality are important, but might be important in different ways. So the idea here is that this is consistent with this hypothesis that weak nonkin bonds provide backup donors when your family, when your primary kin donors go missing. And I think this also nicely illustrates, once again, that vampire bats are not investing in the whole group, they're investing in specific individuals. And those individuals that they're investing in are not only kin individuals, but also non-kin. So another point of skepticism is the idea that maybe what we're seeing is an artifact of the lab. So is non-kin cooperation only happening in the lab and that you really wouldn't see this in the wild? And the evidence I'm going to show for this that goes against that is evidence showing that the relationships that we see in the lab can actually continue when we release the bats in the wild, and they're also completely consistent with what other people have seen in the field studying bats, without bringing them into the lab. But one of the ways that we've been able to study their relationships very well in the field is using these proximity sensors, which essentially send signals to each other and then identify how far apart they are from each other. So we can put these on a group of bats, and then every 2 seconds, actually, they signal to each other, and then we know the distance of those bats to each other. And this allows us to track relationships from the lab to the field, or when the bats are out foraging, we can continue tracking their associations with each other. So I'll give you one example of how we use this technology to show that relationships in the lab persist in the wild. So in that experiment I showed you before, where we formed new relationships, we pulled these bats into captivity, we kept them there, and we had many observations of donations, 668 food sharing events, over 3,000 allogrooming events. We could see cooperation increasing in captivity among certain pairs of bats. Then we put them back in the wild and we tracked them for 8 days. And the question that we had was, were the bats that had these relationships in captivity, would these relationships persist when we release them back in the wild? And so to do that, we also put sensors on groups of bats that we never brought into captivity, the same exact sensors we put on them as a sort of control group, and then we put everybody back into the same tree where we originally caught them. And first thing we could see almost right away is that the bats that were in captivity together for 2 years, they sort of self-assorted. They formed a little community with each other that was distinct from other bats. Even though that everybody was sort of intermixing, it wasn't completely homogeneous. And this is especially true of the captive-born bats. The captive-born bats actually left this tree within the first few days, possibly trying to home back to where they went, but also it looked like they were getting in fights with the other bats. They didn't integrate well back into the wild colony. But the bats that were born at this roost and then were in captivity for 2 years together and then put back, they just preferentially associated with each other. So this is just showing how high the resolution of this data is. This is showing each minute. You can see the associations of the bats with each other. They form these little clusters. The clusters break apart. So it wasn't that the two groups were completely separate, but we could sort of look at this in a very fine temporal and spatial scale. So the yellow bats are the bats that were together in captivity, and the purple ones are the ones that were never captive. Here's another example. Just looking at now minutes rather than seconds. And so all of this structure is going on inside the tree. This is a world that we haven't been able to look at before. So normally when we would look at social networks of bats, we would just look at movements between trees. And now we can see what's going on inside of a tree or inside of a cave. So the basic take-home message here is that the previously captive bats, they roosted closer together in the wild. And the ones that were roosting closest together were the ones that were sharing food and grooming each other. And this is true even after you control for kinship. So food sharing and social grooming predicted roosting networks in the wild, even accounting for kinship, and kinship was actually not as strong of a predictor as food sharing or grooming. Okay, I'm running low on time here, so I'll try to get through this last part. We're also looking at these foraging networks of how bats are preying potentially on the same individual. And this is stuff we're doing now. We're interested in these fights that occur over wounds. Are bats tolerating each other at the wound site, or are they fighting with each other? So we know that these scuffles can happen. Here's some of our own video. That was footage shot by the BBC with fancy cameras, but here's work that my postdoc Simon Ripperger took just walking around with this herd of cattle, and you could see some bats being okay together, sharing animal, and then other bats fighting with each other. And this, we want to know, do these kind of foraging encounters, are they mapping onto what we see in the roost? So there's an example of bats like chasing each other away. Okay, so what we basically found with social foraging is that the bats are leaving the roost independently, but then they're reuniting with particular individuals over and over again out on these cattle pastures. And here's an example showing the data as the foraging bout of a bat. So each row is a bat. And this is all just one day. So we have multiple days of data, but this is showing just one day. The yellow bats are the bats that were previously in captivity together. And then these are the bats that are in the control group. So we're actually, in a sense, more interested in these ones because we know that their behavior is more what we would expect in a wild group of bats. And this gray bar, this is the bat leaving the roost and then coming back to the roost. And so you can see they're actually leaving at totally different times. Each of these lines is a half hour apart. So these bats are not leaving en masse together, but they are meeting up. So these black dots, these are this bat encountering one of the other bats. And these encounters are occurring across days, more than you expect by chance within specific pairs. And then they're predicted by the association inside the tree with the grooming rates in these bats, where we know the grooming and food sharing. It's predicted by grooming and food sharing. And again, this is independent of kinship. So they have a relationship that with specific nonkin that is the same relationship that they had in captivity, and it predicts who they're foraging with and also who they're roosting near in the roost. We don't know how they meet up at the cattle, but we think it might have to do with these calls that they might make to each other. There's some calls that we have well understood from captivity that they use to recognize each other as individuals, which we call contact calls. There's echolocation, of course, but we've also recorded these calls, but we've only seen in foraging bats. So we want to do some experiments to see what those calls might be communicating. And then there's other kinds of calls they use when they're fighting. So this is sort of going into what we're currently working on. One thing we want to know is whether kinship is conveyed by call similarity. So we have some evidence for that, but we're still trying to tease that apart. Because if so, it means that there's a possibility for bats to actually recognize unfamiliar kin, and we don't know if that's the case. Another thing is whether there's call convergence that might occur during social bonding. So we have some weak evidence for this, that we don't know if vampire bats are capable of vocal learning at all, but this is something we hope to answer in the next few years. So to wrap up, I just want to sort of speculate and tie this all together with a slide that is both, it's sort of it's speculation about how I think food sharing actually evolved in vampire bats, which I don't think we'll ever know because we don't have, there's not good fossil, it's hard to understand, behavior for species that are no longer around. There's 3 species of vampire bats. They all share food. So I don't know if we'll ever be able to reconstruct what happened over evolutionary time, but this is my speculation about that, which does also match the way that modern vampire bats actually sort of allocate food sharing. So there's an aspect to this that we can actually test, which is whether they actually make these decisions now. So I'm kind of conflating 2 different things here: the way that food sharing evolved and the way that vampire bats actually make decisions about who they want to share food with. I think both of these things follow the pattern that I'm showing here on this slide. So I think every female has maternal care for her offspring, which then transitions into extended maternal care. She keeps feeding her daughter when her daughter grows up. Her daughter feeds her back, and all of this is just parental care and kin selection. And then I think what's added, though, is I think at some point there was a transition. I think when bats have equally related kin, they'll prefer to feed the kin that reciprocate more often. So if you have two sisters and one of them you have a good relationship with, another you have a bad relationship with, for whatever reason, whether it's personality or just the experiences you had together or how long you've been associated with each other, there's a difference in your investment in those relationships based not only on kinship, but on your experiences that you've had. Now, once that happens, I think it's easy then that this strategy gets extended to nonkin. So bats might prefer to feed bats that reciprocate more often, even if those other individuals are less related or even non-related. And we haven't demonstrated this yet in vampire bats because we still need to show that they will switch away from partners that don't feed them and that they will choose partners that do feed them. And we're working on those experiments now. But essentially, this is what I think is going on. This is my working hypothesis. And I think once you have a network of reciprocal relationships, it then behooves you to try to form new relationships because of this idea of social bet hedging that I discussed, which is that it can be the case that you want to have a wider network. Even if your most valuable partners are kin, you might also want to have non-kin, just in case the kin aren't there on the night that you need them. Okay, and with that, I will thank all these people who I'm not going to go through because there's just way too many people to name them all. And I can take any questions that you guys have. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here so I can, I don't know if I can actually see people. I guess I won't be able to see people because there's nobody physically, or there's nobody with a camera on them.